Hello, welcome to another Tales of Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. Today, we will be doing a new story. Today is going to be The Rats in the Walls. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a longer tale. It's about 14 pages. So, we're going to be splitting this one up into two parts. I'm only going to be reading 7 pages for tonight. And then we're going to finish the rest of the story for next time on part 2. So, hopefully, at page 7, it ends off on a cliffhanger of some sort. I'm not too sure. I've never read this story, same as you guys, so I'm kind of like reading this all in real time. 5, 6, 7. All right, let's put bookmarker right there to end. All right, so here we go. Grab your blankies, grab your snacks, because it's time for a spooky tale of horror. The Rats in the Walls. On July 16th, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labors. The restoration had been a stupendous task, for little had remained of the deserted pile but a shell-like ruin. Yet because it had been the seat of my ancestors, I let no expense deter me. The place had not been inhabited since the reign of James I, when a tragedy of intensely hideous, though largely unexplained nature had struck down. The master, 5 of his children, and several servants, and driven forth under a cloud of suspicion and terror the third son, my lineal propagator, progenitor, in the only survivor of the abhorred line. With this sole heir denounced as a murderer, the state had reverted to the crown, nor had the accused man made any attempt to exculpate himself or regain his property. Shaken by some horror greater than that of conscience or the law, and expressing only a frantic wish to exclude the ancient edifice from his sight and memory, Walter de la Poer, 11th Baron Exham, fled to Virginia, and there founded the family which by the next century had become known as Delapoer. Exham Priory had remained untenanted, though later allotted to the estates of the Norrie family, and much studied because of its peculiar composite architecture, an architecture involving Gothic towers resting on a Saxon or Romanesque substructure, whose foundation in turn was of a still earlier order or blend of order, Roman and even Druidic or native, Cimeric, if legend speaks truly. This foundation was a very singular thing, being merged on one side with the solid limestone of the precipice form, whose brink of the priory overlooked a desolate valley 3 miles west of the village of Anchester. Architects and antiquarians loved to examine his strange relic of forgotten centuries, but the country folk hated it. They had hated it hundreds of years before, when my ancestor lived there, and they hated it now. With the moss and mold of abandonment on it, I had not been a day in Anchester before I knew I came of an accursed house. And this weak workman had blown up Exham Priory, and was busy obliterating the traces of its foundations. The bare static of my ancestry I had always known, together with the fact that my first American forebear had come to the colonies under a strange cloud. Of details, however, I had been kept wholly ignorant through the policy of reticence always maintained by the Delapoers. Unlike our planter neighbors, we seldom boasted of crusading ancestors or other medieval and Renaissance heroes. nor was any kind of tradition handed down except what may have been recorded in the sealed envelope left before the Civil War by every squire to his eldest son for posthumous opening. The glories we cherished were those achieved since the migration, the glories of a proud and honorable, if somewhat reserved and unsocial Virginia line. During the war, our fortunes were extinguished, and our whole existence changed by the burning of Carfax, our home on the banks of the James. My grandfather, advanced in years, had perished in that incendiary outrage, and with him the envelope that bound us all to the past. I can recall that fire today, as I saw then at the age of 7, with the Federal soldiers shouting, the woman screaming, oh, and the N words howling and praying. This is an old book written by a really racist guy. Just heads up on that. Okay, stories are still fucking pretty good, but like, yeah, a lot of controversy on these. Just heads up. Forgot content warning on some of this. Okay, my father was in the army defending Richmond. And after many formalities, my mother and I were passed through the lines to join him. When the war ended, we all moved north, whence my mother had come, and I grew to manhood, middle age, and ultimate wealth as a stolid Yankee. Neither my father nor I knew what our hereditary envelope had contained, and as I merged into the grayness of Massachusetts business life, I lost all interest in the mysteries, which evidently lurked far back in my family tree. Had I suspected their nature, how gladly I would have left Exon Priory to its moss, bats, and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, but without any message to leave me, or to my only child, Alfred, a motherless boy of 10. It was his boy who reversed the order of family information. For although I could give him only jesting conjectures about the past, he wrote me of some very interesting ancestral legends when the late war took him to England in 1917 as an aviation officer. Apparently, the Delapours had a colorful and perhaps sinister history, for a friend of my son's, Captain Edward Norreys, of the Royal Flying Corps, dwelt near the family seat at Anchester, and related some pleasant superstitions which few novelists could equal for wilderness and incredibility. Norreys himself, of course, did not take them seriously, but they amused my son and made good material for his letters to me. It was this legendary which definitely turned my attention to my transatlantic heritage and made me resolve to purchase and restore the family seat which Norreys shrewd to Alfred in its picturesque desertion, and offered to get for him at a surprisingly reasonable figure, since his own uncle was the present owner. I bought Exham Priory in 1918, but was almost immediately distracted from my plans of restoration by the return of my son as a maimed invalid. During the 2 years that he lived, I thought of nothing but his care, having even placed my business under the direction of partners. In 1921, as I found myself bereaved and aimless, I retired, a retired manufacturer no longer young. I resolved to divert my remaining years as my new possessions. Visiting Manchester in December, I entertained by Cap. I was entertained by Captain Norreys, a plump, amiable young man who had thought much of my son and secured his assistance in gathering plans and anecdotes to guide in my coming restoration. Exum Priory itself was without emotion, a jumble of tottering medieval ruins covered with lynchings and honeycombs and with rooks' nests perched precariously upon a precipice, and denuded of floors and other interior features save the stone walls of the separate towers. As I gradually recovered the image of the edifice as it had been when my ancestor left it over 3 centuries before, I began to hire workmen for the reconstruction. In every case, I was forced to go outside the immediate locality, for the Anchester villagers had an almost unbelievable fear and hatred of the place. This sentiment was so great that it was sometimes communicated to the outside laborers, causing numerous desertions, whilst its slope appeared to include both the priory and its ancient family. My son had told me that he was somewhat avoided during his visits because he was a de la Poyer, and I now found myself suddenly ostracized for a like reason until I convinced the peasants how little I knew of my heritage. Even then, they sullenly disliked me, so I had to collect most of the village traditions through the mediations of Norries. What the people could not forgive, perhaps, was that I had come to restore a symbol of abhorrent to them. For rationally or not, they viewed Exham Priory as nothing less than a haunt of fiends and werewolves. Piecing together the tales which Norries collected for me, and supplementing them with the accounts of several savants who had studied the ruins, I deduced that Exham Priory stood on the site of a prehistoric temple, a druidic or anti druidical thing, which must have been contemporary with Stonehenge. That indescribable rites had been celebrated there, few doubted, and there were unpleasant tales of the transference of these rites into the Cybele worship, which the Romans had introduced. Inscriptions still visible on the subcellar bore such unmistakable letters as Div Ops Magna Mat, signs of the Magna Mater, whose dark worship was once vainly forbidden to Roman citizens. Anchester had been the camp of the Third Augustan Legion, as many remains attest, and it was said that the Temple of Selby was splendid and thronged with worshippers who performed nameless ceremonies at the bidding of a Pharyngian priest. Tales added that the fall of the old religion did not end the orgies at the temple, but that the priest lived on in the new faith without real change. Likewise, was it said that the rites did not vanish with the Roman power, and that certain among the Saxons added to what remained of the temple, and gave it the essential outline it subsequently preserved, making it the center of a cult feared through half the heptarchy. Heptarchy? Heptarchy. Heptarchy. About 1000 AD, the place is mentioned in a chronicle as being a substantial stone priory housing a strange and powerful monastic order, surrounded by extensive gardens which needed no walls to exclude a frightened populace. It was never destroyed by the Danes, though after the Norman conquest, it must have declined tremendously, since there was no impediment when Henry III granted the site to my ancestor, Gilbert de la Poer, first Baron Exam in 1261. Of my family before this date, there was no evil report. But something strange must have happened then. In one chronicle, there's a reference to the Delapore as cursed of God. In 1307, whilst village legendary had nothing but evil and frantic fear to tell of the castle that went up in the foundations of the old temple and priory, the fireside tales were the most grisly description. All the ghastly, all the ghastlier because of their frightened reticence and cloudy evasiveness. They represented my ancestors as a race of hereditary demons, beside whom Gilles and Retz and the Marquise de Sade would seem the veriest tyros, and hinted whisperingly at their responsibility for the occasional disappearance of villagers through several generations. The worst characters apparently were the barons and their direct heirs. At least, most was whispered about these. If of healthier inclinations, it was said an heir would early and mysteriously die to make way for another, more typical Xian. There seemed to be an inner cult in the family, presided over by the head of the house, and sometimes closed except to a few members. Temperament, rather than ancestry, was evidently the basis of this cult, for it was entered by several who married into the family. Lady Margaret Trevor from Cornwall, wife of Godfrey, the second son of the fifth Baron, became a favorite bane of children all over the countryside, and the daemon heroine of a peculiarly, peculiar, peculiarly, peculiarly horrible old ballad, not yet extinct near the Welsh border. Preserved in balladry, too, though balladry, too, though not illustrating the same point, is the hideous tale of Lady Mary de la Poyere, who shortly after her marriage to the Earl of Shrewsfield was killed by him and his mother, both of the slayers being absolved and blessed by the priest to whom they confessed what they dared not repeat to the world. These myths and ballads, typical as they were of crude superstition, repelled me greatly. Their persistence and their application to so long a line of my ancestors were especially annoying, whilst the imputations of monstrous habits provided unpleasantly reminiscent of the one known scandal of my immediate forebears, the case of my cousin, young Randolph Delapour of Carfax, who went among the N-word and became a voodoo priest after he returned from the Mexican War. It was much less disturbed by the vaguer tales of wails and howling in the barren, wind-swept valley beneath the limestone cliff of the graveyard stretches after the spring rains of the floundering, squealing white thing on which Sir John Clave's horse had trod one night in a lonely field, and of the servant who had gone mad at what he saw in the priory in the full light of day. These things were hackneyed spectral lore, and I was at that time a pronounced skeptic. The accounts of vanished peasants were less to be dismissed, though not especially significant in view of medieval customs. Prying curiosity meant death, and more than one severed head had been publicly strewn in the bastions now effaced around Exham Priory. Now effaced around Exham. A few of the tales were exceedingly picturesque, and made me wish I had learnt more of the comparative mythology in my youth. There was, for instance, the belief that a legion of bat-winged devils kept witches' Sabbath each night at the priory, a legion whose substance might explain the disproportionate abundance of coarse vegetables harvested in the vast gardens. And most vivid of all, there was the dramatic epic of the rats, the scampering army of obscene vermin which had burst forth from the castle 3 months after the tragedy that doomed it to desertion. The lean, filthy, ravenous army which had swept all before it and devoured fowl, cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, and even two hapless human beings before its fury was spent. Around that unforgettable rodent army, a whole separate cycle of myths revolved, for it scattered among the village homes and brought curses and horrors in its train. Such was the lore that assailed me as I pushed to completion. Oh, chill, dude. Push to completion. Sheesh. Okay. With an elderly obstinacy, the work of restoring my ancestral home. It might not be imagined for a moment that these tales formed my principal psychological environment. On the other hand, I was constantly praised and encouraged by Captain Norris and the antiquarians who surrounded and aided me. When the task was done over 2 years after its commencement, I viewed the great rooms, wainscoted walls, vaulted ceilings, mullioned windows, and broad staircases with the pride which fully compensated for the prodigious expense of the restoration. Every tribute of the Middle Ages was cunningly reproduced, and the new parts blended perfectly with the original walls and foundations. The seat of my fathers was complete, and I looked forward to redeeming at last the local fame of the line which ended in me. I would reside here permanently and prove that a Delapoyer, for I had adopted again the original spelling of the name, need not be a fiend. My comfort was perhaps augmented by the fact that although Exham Priory was medievally fitted, its interior was in truth wholly new and free from the old vermin and old ghosts alike. As I have said, I moved in on July 16th, 1923. My household consisted of 7 servants and 9 cats, of which later species I am particularly fond. My eldest cat, oh my god, no way he named his cat that. I'm not gonna say that. I'm not gonna say that. Was 7 years old and had come with me from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. The others I had accumulated whilst living with Captain Norrie's family during the restoration of the priory. For 5 days, our routine proceeded with the utmost placidity, my time being spent mostly in the codification of old family data, and had now obtained some very circumstantial accounts of the final tragedy and flight of Walter de la Poyere, which I conceived to be the probable contents of the hereditary paper lost in the fire at Carfax. It appeared that my ancestor was accused, with much reason, of killing all the other members in his household, except 4 servant confederates, in their sleep about 2 weeks after shocking discovery, which changed his whole demeanor, but which, except by implication, he disclosed to no one save perhaps the servants who assisted him and afterwards fled beyond reach. This deliberate slaughter which included a father, three brothers, and two sisters, was largely condoned by the villagers and so slackly treated by the law that perpetrate that its perpetrator escaped honored, unharmed, and disguised to Virginia. The general whispered sentiment. The general's whispered sentiment being that he had purged the land of an immemorial curse. What discovery had prompted an act so terrible, I could scarcely even conjecture. Walter de la Poyere must have known for years the sinister tales about his family, so that his material could have given him no fresh impulse. Had he then witnessed some appalling ancient rite, or stumbled upon some frightful and revealing symbol in the priory or its vicinity, he was reputed to have been a shy, gentle youth in England. In Virginia, he seemed not so much hard or bitter as harassed and apprehensive. He was spoken of in the diary of another gentleman adventurer, Francis Harley of Bellevue, as a man of unexampled justice, honor, and delicacy. On July 22nd occurred the first incident which, though lightly dismissed at the time, takes on a paternal significance in relation to later events. It was so simple as to be almost negligible, and could not possibly have been noticed under the circumstances, for it must have been recalled that since I was in a building particularly fresh and new except for the walls, and surrounded by a well balanced staff of servitors, apprehension would have been absurd despite the locality. What I afterward remembered is merely this: that my old black cat, whose moods I know so well, was undoubtedly alert and anxious to an extent wholly out of keeping with his natural character. He roved from room to room, restless and disturbed, and sniffed constantly about the walls which formed parts of the old Gothic structure. I realize how trite this sounds, like the inevitable dog in the ghost story, which always growls before his master sees the sheeted figure, yet I cannot consistently suppress it. The following day, a servant complained of restlessness among all the cats in the house. He came to me in my study, a lofty west room on the second story. He groaned, arches, black oak paneling, and a triple Gothic window overlooking the limestone cliff and desolate valley. And even as he spoke, I saw the jetty form. Okay, dude, this is a little racy, okay, man. Creeping along the west wall and scratching at the new panels which overlaid the ancient stone, I told the man that there must have been some singular odor or emanation from the old stonework, imperceptible to human senses, but affecting the delicate organs of cats even though the new woodwork. This I truly believed, and when the fellow suggested the presence of mice or rats, I mentioned that there had been no rats there for 300 years, and that even the field mice of the surrounding country could hardly be found in these high walls, where they had never been known to stray. That afternoon, I called on Captain Norreys, and he assured me that it would be quite incredible for field mice to infest the priory in such a sudden and unprecedented fashion. That night, dispensing as usual with a valet, I retired in the West Tower chamber, which I had chosen as my own, reached from the study by a stone staircase and short gallery. The former partly ancient and later entirely restored. The room was circular, with high and without wainscoting being hung with arrays which I had myself chosen in London. Seeing the cat was with me, I shut the heavy Gothic door and retired by the light of the electric bulbs which so cleverly counterfeited candles. Finally switching off the light and sinking on the carved and canopied four-poster with the venerable cat in his accustomed place across my feet. I did not draw the curtains, but gazed out at the narrow north window which I faced. There was a suspicious suspicion of aurora in the sky, and the delicate traceries of the window were pleasantly silhouetted. At some time I must have fallen quite asleep, for I recall a distinct sense of leaving strange dreams when the cat started violently from his placid position. I saw him in the faint auroral glow, head strained forward, 4 feet on my ankles, and hind feet stretching behind. He was looking intensely at a point on the wall somewhat west of the window, a point which my eye had nothing to mark it, but towards which all my attention was now directed. And as I watched, I knew that cat was not vainly excited. Whether the auras actually moved, I cannot say. I think it did very slightly, but what I can swear to is that behind it, I heard a low, distinct scurrying as of rats or mice. In a moment, the cat had jumped bodily on the screening tapestry, bringing the affected section of the floor with its weight, and exposing a damp, ancient wall of stone patched here and there by the restorers, and devoid of any trace of rodent prowlers. The cat raced up and down the floor by this part of the wall, clawing the fallen arras, and seemingly trying at times to insert a paw between the wall and the oaken floor. He found nothing, and after a time returned wearily to his place across my feet. I had not moved, but I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I questioned all the servants and found that none of them had noticed anything unusual, save that the cook remembered the actions of a cat, which had rested on her windowsill. This cat had howled at something unknown, had howled at something at some unknown hour of the night, awakening the cook in time for her to see him dart purposefully out of the open door down the stairs. I drowsed away the noon time, and in the afternoon called again on Captain Norris, who became exceedingly interested in what I told him. The old incidents, so slight yet so curious, appealed to his sense of picturesque and elicited from him a number of reminiscences of local ghostly lore. When we're genuinely perplexed at the presence of rats, the Norries lent me some traps and Paris green, which I had the servants place in strategic locations when I returned. And that is where we will leave off for tonight's reading. That is part 1 of The Rats in the Wall. If you guys want to come back for the reading for next time, I will be live tomorrow, probably around the same time as well, finishing up this story. But I hope you guys enjoy this. If you want to watch live, make sure you go follow on twitch.tv/stigmaxoxo. And if you're watching from YouTube, make sure you hit that like and subscribe down below. It helps out with the algorithms quite a bit. Make sure you subscribe to the channel too. And if you want to check out some of other tales, there's going to be boxes that will be popping up on the video somewhere around over here. They're going to be the Grimm's Fairy Tales, which should be on this side, and then the Tales of Horror, which should be on this side. We've already gone through a couple of them. There's some really good tales in there. If you want any recommendations, I definitely check out that very first one, the Dagon. That one was real fucking good. Also, Reanimator was a pretty good read too. Go check that one out. But I hope you guys have a wonderful night. I'll see you on the next reading. And until then, good night. Don't let the Cthulhu's bite. Bye. Later, later, later. Bye.